So yeah, what I was hoping we could talk about is um, the social implications of technology disruption, and they're sort of unavoidable. We've touched on them, of course, but in particular, I'm wondering if we can think of any sort of solid general principles that might operate across many different cases of disruption that can be useful as a guide for how to maximize the benefits of relatively rapid and abrupt and um, substantial technological change and minimize the harms of that. And I think that at the present moment, we certainly can imagine that the disruptions that seem to be imminent in a number of different sectors. So we've got energy, we've talked about, we've got transportation, we've got food and agriculture, we've got human labor, the labor markets of, globally. It's easy to imagine that as extraordinary as some of the benefits might be, there also be major harms done to individuals, to communities, and perhaps even to entire societies, because there are almost certainly going to be livelihoods lost by the tens of millions, farmers especially come to mind. But if we automate labor more broadly, then who knows which livelihoods will even be safe. So we can imagine that there are some major downsides, major risks of harm, even if the potential benefits in the longer term, in principle, hold. And I should avoid using the word in principle there, because I wanted to reserve that actually for thinking of principles of how to sort of maximize the benefits and minimize the risks and harms. But at any rate, we can imagine that there will be both benefits and detriments to disruption, certainly in the short term. And I'm wondering if we can be systematic in our evaluation of any general rules or general principles that apply to sort of charting a path, an optimal path through that challenge, right? That difficulty of getting the most out of these things without sort of descending into chaos in the process. And I think that there are a number of reasons for doing this. I mean, one, on its face, it seems like it's pretty obvious. But a second one that's perhaps not quite so obvious is that if we want societies to be prepared for these technological changes that are coming, and if we imagine that there is an inevitability to them, then the overarching idea of them needs to be palatable. And right now, it's so threatening because the downsides are so obvious to so many people, or easy to imagine for so many people at any rate, whether they're valid or not. That the instinctive reaction is to sort of to hunker down and defend the status quo. And as we've talked about, I mean, if these changes are in a sense inevitable, then that is quite a futile response, as well as ultimately being suboptimal if the benefits outweigh the harms, which we imagine, I think that they probably will in the longer term. So at any rate, this is always kind of a fancy way of saying, let's see if we can figure out a general way to think about disruption and make it more of a good thing than a bad thing.
Yeah, I wonder I guess one of the reasons why people might be hesitant to be enthusiastic about technological disruption is that, well, I wouldn't call globalization, at least the latest version, exactly a technological disruption, but it's certainly a disruption in the organization of manufacturing and labor. And this is kind of a textbook example of how not to do it in a way, right? In the sense that, the benefits and harms are accrued to different groups of people, and the benefits accrued to small numbers of people relatively, at least in terms of, that's not fair, but they definitely accrue to different groups of people, right? As many, say, Midwestern towns in the United States can attest. So it seems like the key problem is something like aligning incentives, right? I don't know how to think about that at a country scale, but one of the key innovations of the joint stock company. So there was an interesting book I read. I think it's by William Rosen. It's called The Most Important Idea in the World, or something along those lines. It was about the Industrial Revolution, but it was not about, well, it was partly about technology, but it was emphasizing the role of patents and the joint stock limited liability corporation in being the vehicle for coordinating groups of people by aligning their incentives, namely by giving people stock if they're part of an enterprise, so that they are aligned with the long-term benefit of the company and not just aligned with the short-term benefit that would be the case if they only drew a salary, right?
Right, and I think in a perhaps not in an explicit way, but I think in an implicit way, many utopian approaches to social organization or social critique, and I'm thinking in particular Marxist analyses and the interpretations of Marxism and communism and socialism, their various different flavors that followed in the wake of that. I think a part of the concern there was that the interests of labor and of capital were in conflict, and the thinking was, well, we can imagine a new social order that aligns those. In other words, if the workers own the capital, then that aligns the incentives, and it solves that misalignment problem, or at least allegedly, or at least implicitly, that seems, you can infer that was a major part of the goal of the prescriptive responses to Marx's original analysis, and a lot of his original analysis showed, I think, that what happens when these incentives are misaligned, and I think it's a lot of social thinking even today now, especially with this focus in the last generation or so in the social sciences on power in its various different forms. That's also, deeply connected to incentives, right? So I think you've really hit on a key idea there, which is through these disruptions, we've been talking about just disruption, but I suppose it could be any technological change. Keeping incentives aligned, or correcting misalignments of the past, or ensuring that new misalignments don't emerge. That seems to be a very important sort of general principle to try to keep keep or ensure the alignment among incentives. Yeah, very, very good.
Yeah, if I could use a computational metaphor. So the thing that strikes me that's clever about the way that, say, startups work versus the way a large part of management is somehow constructing proxies for the true goal function, which you can implement locally and which you can get employees in a small part of an organization to optimize for, but which are somehow correlated with the overall goal you're trying to maximize, if that's an appropriate language, right? Where if I draw on the board here, if here's your organization and somehow out here is the target function, whether that's income or, if it's a company, if it's a country, wealth, or, wealth plus whatever metric you decide to optimize for, maybe that's leisure time, doesn't matter. But that overall aggregate quantity is a function of many individual decisions in a very complicated way, right? And decisions that don't directly affect the end goal, but do so through many intermediaries. So maybe this is an individual and they're working inside a company and they only affect the overall well-being via their effect on the production of wheat. And so this is wheat. And wheat only affects overall wealth by, being sold at a supermarket and et cetera, and all the way through. And a key management problem is to work backwards from that desired end goal to implement at each node some kind of local goal or loss function in machine learning language for which individuals will optimize. And that's incredibly difficult, and I guess doesn't really work. One of the places where it really works is small companies in the early stages, namely startups, where stock options are a very transparent mechanism for making this correlation between the sort of desired goal, which is increasing the value of the company, and individual actions. And individual actions can have a tangible effect on that just by looking at the number of customers changed in a month or whatever. And that's kind of why I guess people like working, or some people like working at such organizations, because that connection between the goal and individual action is so tight. And it's a lack of respect for that. I mean, it seems to me that one of the major critiques of socialism is just that it pretends this problem doesn't exist, right? As though
right.
you simply, I mean, this problem is everything, right? This is the problem of civilization. This problem is the hardest problem we have in many cases, and it's solved in some way by market forces, I suppose you could say, although maybe not very efficiently. But to pretend as though it doesn't exist is, I'm not saying this is, a modern socialist doesn't make this mistake probably, but Marx certainly underestimated the difficulty of that. And if I think about what happened in the latest round of globalization, and which no doubt certainly has informed the attitude towards technological disruption of many of your countrymen, Adam.
Yep.
Then it's very difficult to imagine actually how you because people will always say, and they did say, and kept saying for decades in the UK, in America, here in Australia, that globalization is great. It will benefit everybody, and if you're resisting it, then you're a protectionist redneck moron. And of course, many of the predicted harms of globalization did come to pass for many parts of society, and the fact that that happened continues to be denied by many elites, and is one of the reasons why politics is completely broken in your homeland and in the UK and increasingly here. So I think I'm very skeptical of the capacity of current elites to talk honestly about the cost-benefit trade-offs of technological disruption, at least in the West. And so the solution can't be to simply get the elites and experts to think about it and then tell everybody a reasonable thing to do, because at this point, nobody will believe them, and nor should they probably. So it seems
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that, I think promises aren't enough for getting us through the coming wave of technological disruption. I don't know whether it's mechanisms like cryptocurrency or something else, but something that doesn't require trust in elites, because that at this point is dead in the water.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I just wrote I'm working on a new essay, a new blog post for our site that touches on a little bit of that in the with respect to the climate science community. The specific example I'm using is that we are sort of in a legitimacy crisis among. I'm not thinking sort of power elites or political or economic elites. I'm thinking in terms of authorities of knowledge, so knowledge elites, whether they're academic or the scientific community more broadly than just academia, government institutions of science and technology. So the CDC, for example, in the United States, has come under a lot of scrutiny. It's made some major missteps during the COVID-19 pandemic, and in the case of climate change, the current piece I'm working on, it points out these major flaws, major errors, fundamental sort of mistakes that the that the environmental and climate science community made with respect to technology in its in the core scenarios that the entire community shares and that the entire community bases models and analysis on and recommendations to policymakers. And we talked about those. And of course, one of a key crisis of legitimacy that I think is coming is that the community refuses to admit those errors and is not owning up to them, and this is only fueling the conspiracy narrative, the politically motivated pushback that says the scientific community has an agenda and is being dishonest, and by refusing to admit an error, we end up, looking like the only other alternative, which is liars. And when you make a big mistake, you can either admit that you were a fool, or you can pretend it was deliberate. But if it's a big enough mistake, people are going to say, "Wow, that was really horrible," if you really did that deliberately. That's what it's sort of fueling that doubt in the legitimacy of these authorities. And so I completely see where you're coming from. It's been on my mind recently. And one thing that occurred to me in the process of thinking about this and looking at the diagram, it makes sense with what you've drawn up here, is that we have I think we have a major disconnect between this enormous engine that is producing income and wealth and the traditional mechanisms by which that income and wealth would have recirculated back to throughout society, right? So although societies in the past, the wealth was certainly polarized, and income was captured by capital owners and elites of various kinds, political elites and so forth. It was of a different magnitude and of a different, I think, maybe character than in the era of globalization and giant multinational corporations and individual people who are worth $200+ billion now. This just looks shocking to people, and individuals are operating inside a system where we can see that a fantastic amount of wealth is being created, and yet somehow they're still struggling, they're hanging on by their fingernails, and the traditional mechanisms of claw it back with taxation and then redistribute it, that just seems to be fundamentally broken in some societies like the United States, or at least functioning so poorly and inadequately that people have lost all confidence in it as an effective mechanism. I'll stop there for a second and let you chime in, Dan. But there is a follow up to that, which I'll get to in a minute. But go ahead and
I was just going to comment one thing, which is the increases in wealth inequality within developed countries, let's say. I mean, as you know, the global inequality has decreased dramatically due to globalization because China and India have become much less poor than they were. Mainly that's the cause. But within countries like the US, inequality has increased. But it's not because, the major driver of that is the rise of professionals and large salaries rather than necessarily return on capital. I guess there's a lot to Piketty's argument about the return on capital and so on, but the statistics show that it's just large numbers of people with high salaries that drives the inequality. I mean, it depends how you measure inequality, I guess. But I think in terms of the social effects, there have always been, Rockefellers and Bezoses and Gates. Yeah. And I don't think it's I don't think the fact that Bezos is much more wealthy than Rockefeller, if indeed he is relative to, global wealth or whatever. I don't think that's the driver of the problems we're seeing, because those people, they have a lot of influence, but I think it's a bit of a cartoon villain problem where people imagine every problem in the world is caused by the Koch brothers or something.
Right.
I think seems to me much more the case that the existence of a large kind of stable, in China, it's clearly an aristocracy. In the West, I think it has many aspects of that. It's less dramatic and clear cut here, perhaps, because we tend to think of it as still to some degree meritocratic. That's I think the what's the term? Social mobility figures tend to indicate that, in fact, America can not really call itself a meritocracy to a great degree anymore. I mean, more so than many other places, but much less so than it was in the 70s and 80s, for example.
Right.
And the emergence of that quasi-permanent elite class of managers and media elites and others. I mean, that's the part of the kind of Trump-Bannon critique of society that is true. I mean, lots of it's insane, but there is some truth to that, and it's tied to the development of wealth inequality and to the fact that that class of people, to which, I mean, I guess you could say both of us belong, at least we're at the lower ends of that, the monopoly that we have over the decisions that affect, for example, globalization. I mean, not us directly, of course, but sort of the class of people to whom we talk and circulate with. Basically, the rest of the population doesn't trust us/them anymore, and maybe they shouldn't. And this is, I think.
Certainly in the United States, that trust is that, or that distrust is it's hard to argue that it's not justified. And we often hear, and whether it's accurate or not, we hear this common refrain: the United States is the richest country in the history of the world. And you can split hairs on that, but at any rate, it's the United States is a very, very wealthy country, both in absolute terms, taken as a whole, and on a per capita basis. But it's tough to hear that and then find yourself as for example, someone working for minimum wage and really struggling, basically having a more or less impossible time of getting by with any semblance of security. It's very difficult to become invested in the idea that, or rather in the ideal that this represents, so it's understandable.
And I think I'm a bit frustrated actually I used to think of myself as being on the left. I don't know where I sit politically anymore for various reasons, but
Same here.
I'm pretty frustrated with many, most of the people I know from my job are left-leaning, many very left-leaning. And I'm pretty frustrated with people's inability to really understand, well, to even pay attention to, for example, Trump's speeches in the 2016 election. It's easy to caricature Trump as an idiot, and, certainly not a fan of Trump, but I read his ghostwritten books and I listened to his speeches because I thought he might win, as he did. And, those speeches are a very clear, articulate critique of decades of promises by elites that globalization would be great, followed by the, gut-wrenching decrease in living standards in many parts of the US, and that's echoed in many other places, of course, outside of the US. And people can connect the dots, right? Even though they're being told the dots are not connected over and over and over. People aren't stupid, and they can observe basic facts about the world and draw conclusions. So anyway, maybe we're getting on a bit of a tangent, but I think that if one wants people to buy into disruption, then it has to be not that the benefits accrue to people now and then we'll deal with the negative consequences later, which was, of course, promised. There's always vague promises of retraining and all sorts of other things, but somehow they never quite make it into the budget. But you can bet that, whatever changes were necessary to outsource the labor happened pretty fast. The problem is it's sort of unclear how to, and that's what I mean by aligning incentives, right? So to be blunt about it, so the losers from globalization in the next round, whether that's automation or whatever, how do you actually put in place mechanisms that they can trust? that actually align their incentives with the overall goal of leveling up the society to a new level of productivity and wealth, which that is what is achievable with these technological disruptions. But I mean, we're guaranteed to further atomize and destroy our politics and democracies if we let the next 3 disruptions happen in the same way that globalization did. I don't think we'll make it.
So I have a couple of things to. This is great. This is fantastic, and I'm very much of a mind with you on all of this. A couple of things to think about here. The first is that and again, I'm looking at your diagram, but if we think that productive activity, however you want to define that, but let's keep it abstract for now. This productive activity occurs it occurs in let's keep it very abstract. Productive activity occurs in one place, and then the wealth, the value, again, keep it very abstract. Let's not even use income or wealth. More abstract than that. The value, and in some sense, at its most abstract, remove that economic growth and economic production and its pairing to consumption. They're about value. They're about utility in some sense. Okay, so let's keep it very abstract. There is this, going back to Marx, there is this alienation. There is this divide, this separation between productive activity and the value that productive activity realizes in the world. Now, if you want to make all of that more concrete, you can say, well, the people who do a lot of the work inside the companies and institutions and factories and on the farms and wherever else, they are creating a lot of useful stuff, goods and services, and somehow the value of that stuff is captured elsewhere. And there's this gap. Okay, so this has long been observed and discussed and analyzed and so forth. Well, one of the things that my team, and in particular Tony Seba, is very keen on as a potential way to respond to that issue is by the localization of production, and basically a retraction from globalization and withdrawal from the current prevailing model of production, which in our team, I'm not such a fan of it, but our team is generally, you know how these terms are. We just come to use them. Sure. And we get stuck with them. But we call it the sort of the extractive or extractionist based model of production, where you're sort of in a crude sort of cartoon version, you're digging up resources from the ground under your feet, and you're flipping them around, reassembling them into something useful, and then you send it off to the other side of the world, and somewhere people pick a percentage of value off of that constructive work along the way until it reaches its final destination. And it may well literally be on the other side of the world. In fact, for a few things like the ingredients in batteries at the moment, they're crisscrossing oceans several times before they get to their end use, which is, in some ways, madness. And the idea is that if production were to become relocalized as and to shift away from to back off from globalization, then this would allow the value to, if not to remain literally in the same hands as those who produced it, to at least remain in the same communities, in the same regions. That this would go a long way to redressing this problem of alienation at the global scale that we've seen from sort of interregional, international alienation that you talked about with globalization. So this is one potential I wouldn't call it a solution, because it's very unlikely to be a complete solution, but it is a way to sort of redress that problem that we see, by shifting a little bit of the dynamics in the system and tightening the loops so that they don't extend so far from their points of origin.
I have a question about that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess it strikes me as the history of protectionism and the attempt to develop industrialized economies in the presence of, say, the British head start in textiles, plus the, okay, let me start with the example of China and its chip industry currently. So China's been very successful in creating a local tech industry in some sectors, as you know, but so far, well, relative to their expenditure anyway, much less successful in semiconductor manufacturing. And part of the problem there is, well, you can, for example, put subsidies on imports and close off a part of your economy in order to nurture a local competitor. But then the discipline of actually having to sell your product in a competitive marketplace is, I mean, that's part of the signal that comes in at this endpoint here, right? In my diagram, which is so valuable, right? Because your company or there's an incredible amount of fraud and incompetence in the semiconductor industry in China, plus a lot of brilliant engineers, of course, but a lot of their efforts are sort of wasted because of fraud and theft and lying and etc. And that sort of happens in here somewhere, right?
Mm.
But the signal from the outside is a bit like sunlight, and if it
Right,
allows you
it's pretty unequivocal.
to locate those things that are really screwing up, and it gives you the leverage to get rid of the people, even in the face of local opposition and power structures within your company and government interests and connections and all of that. I mean, if you can just point to, we are not succeeding against our international competitor, well, that's a very clear fact that you can use to make the internal changes. So it's a bit like back propagation in training a neural network, right? If you have an error and you can pin it down, then you can correct it. But without that external signal, it's ambiguous actually what's an error. It's a matter of opinion. So I think my concern about relocalizing manufacturing is, to what extent is it actually different to just, for example, putting on tariffs on a country's imports of semiconductors and trying to have a local competitor? I mean, if you do localized production, then at the beginning it's not going to be competitive with the global production. It's a bit like trying to compete with British textiles after they've gotten a head start. You have to put up some kind of tariff boundaries. I don't know any other way to do that historically.
Well,
Succeeded.
I think actually, well, I could be wrong here, but I think the conception is that the new technology, the specific technologies that we're talking about, by their nature, have very low barriers to entry, and or relatively. I shouldn't be so hyperbolic. They have relatively low barriers to entry. They have potentially they're viable at different scales, and so the capital costs are not necessarily prohibitive. I mean, that's obviously the cost of capital is a very big barrier to entry, but expertise and other things are as well. But if you imagine solar panels, for example, one reason why they're arguably have the potential to be democratizing and to help localize production is that unlike a coal power plant, certainly unlike a nuclear power plant, you can build solar panels at any scale. Anything from literally a single panel that costs a few $100s on up. I mean, even smaller than that. You can literally wear solar panels and batteries on your wrist and a wristwatch, and so there are all these viable smaller scales that you can't put a nuclear power plant. I mean, people talk about small modular reactors and so forth, but so far that's it only works in PowerPoint presentations. It's not a reality yet, and we're not close. And certainly coal power plants, that's a similar sort of situation. And so that pattern in principle, we think holds quite well across a number of these technologies. And what that means is that because they can be economically and practically viable at a small scale, locally, and the availability of sunlight everywhere, as opposed to coal, which is only in a few places, and oil, which is only in a few places. Concentrated, unlike concentrated natural resources, sunlight's abundant, in many areas. You have a situation where the localization of production is a logical economic consequence. In other words, it ends up being cheaper than the globalized value chains that we have today, and mainly because the raw materials that you need are available locally. They don't have to come from the other side of the world, and the scaling benefits aren't there. So the savings from having a kilometer-long factory on the other side of the world aren't there, and so they don't justify shipping all over the world to take advantage of those scaling benefits. And so this is the idea, and I think that's what maybe has the potential to offset, I mean, you talked about how this could be something a phenomenon that ran parallel to protectionism and wouldn't work. And I think that there's certainly some of that's true. And I think we're almost certainly likely to see that. I mean, let's say institutions and decision makers who have, and even ideologies and political, parties and so forth that have embraced protectionism in the past, you can bet they're going to trot that same sort of philosophy and thinking out again when it looks like it can work a little better this time, thanks to a helping hand from technology, right? So the thing, we should probably be on our guard for that. But with luck, these technologies will actually be viable economically and competitive, is what I mean by that, at a local level, in a way that local production today isn't, because there's such benefits to scaling of production elsewhere. And it probably doesn't hold across the board, and it's almost certainly an oversimplification. But I think this is one thing that the character of these new technologies at least offers a little glimmer of hope that will be possible. So
I guess I sort of want to believe that, but I actually don't see the argument almost at all. So you could, why doesn't this argument apply? Take manufacturing and replace it by video production. You could have said that YouTube definitely democratized video production and made it accessible. I mean, there's probably 100 times more people making a living making videos, selling makeup, doing 100,000 other things on YouTube, but the Pareto distribution still holds for their incomes. So democratization doesn't mean that you actually, you democratize access to, say, manufacturing, and suddenly you'll have a Pareto distribution again, because some people are just much better at making use of that resource. And the same disruptions will make transportation much cheaper and more efficient. So it will draw the global economy ever tighter together. I'm not an expert, but I do sense a kind of great dose of wishful thinking many of my friends are very enamored of localized production and moving away from, localized governance and many things like that, which I see the draw, but I feel like it's actually a kind of dangerous. It seems to me like it might be a bit of a distraction and if you just accept that the Pareto distribution holds, every technological disruption will heighten its effects and spread it to more areas of the economy, and by default, you can't compete with that, then you're sort of forced into finding a different solution. I feel like relying on decentralization, even the forms of decentralization which have appeared in recent years, decades, in the form of cryptocurrency, which is genuinely a new form of decentralization under the sun. I don't see, they decentralize certain things, like, you don't have to trust centralized institutions to the same degree, but economically, I think there'll be enormous forces for increasing inequality, because they will just multiply by massive factors the return on intelligence. If if smart kids in, rural India can make a living writing smart contracts, then they will, and it will just make the returns on intelligence much higher or something like that. I think like the idea that decentralization automatically leads to leads us back to the glorious 80s when the middle class was functioning and vibrant and on the way up. This just I don't see this. But
yeah, I'm gonna go. Yeah, it's a larger conversation to have, and I'm the biggest, the most vocal fan of this in a general concept on our team is certainly Tony, and he could articulate, I think, some of his reasoning better than I can. I'm sort of having to put myself in his shoes. I have personally, I mean, I can't really respond to all that because I'm going to need more time to think about it. I mean, you raise very, very, very keen, and insightful points there. So rather than trying to, on the spot, think through those, that's going to take me some time, as it always does with the things you bring these conversations, Dan. Instead, let me mention something that I have thought a lot about, which maybe it doesn't make any of this irrelevant, but I think it adds context. So one of the things that I've been thinking about that I think connects to sort of the localization of production, certainly production that can lead to self-sufficiency. And I don't mean self-sufficiency like in some mountain man, rugged individualist in the wilderness kind of thing. I mean like a community or perhaps some, sub-region or regional self-sufficiency. And so connected to that idea, I actually have a lot more of my hopes pinned to the prosperity itself, and in particular, prosperity born of superabundance that for solving some of these problems. And so in some ways, this is quite trite, unfortunately. So there's always been this very, very long time in this idea that people won't complain too much if their bellies are full and they're entertained. The bread and circuses kind of idea that goes back many, many centuries to ancient Rome, and certainly earlier than that. And there are analogs, I think, for that sort of thinking in ancient Chinese philosophy and texts as well. I've encountered that same idea many times. But I do think that there is sort of an underlying logic to it, which is that if life is prosperous enough for everyone, then inequality has less sting to it, right? I mean, if somebody else is alive and healthy, and their children are alive and healthy, and you are dying and your children are unhealthy and dying, this is not an acceptable, kind of inequality that you can live with. But if you're doing fantastic and you have a great quality of life, and somebody else down the road has an even more fantastic quality of life, well, that kind of inequality is something maybe we can live with. And so my what I'm wondering is if in this, again, with these particular technologies we're talking about today at the moment, that according to our analysis are going to radically reduce the costs of pretty much everything in the global economy by reducing the cost and the externalities associated with energy and with transportation and with food and agriculture, and sort of there are multiplicative effects amongst those three things. So they sort of magnify one another's effects, as you can imagine. So that my hope, again, this is just a hope, but my hope is that the material prosperity that emerges and the superabundance, material superabundance that emerges will at least open up the space, open up the possibility that inequality won't matter as much. It will cease to be as consequential as it is today. And I think that may be a precondition for then, coming to agreement about, how to address the problems that will certainly remain afterwards. And so that's a way of saying that right now the problems seem so stark, and that they are so divisive, and there's so little consensus or agreement or common ground about how to address these problems that we've got, distributional problems basically, that we're at a standstill. So even though the problem is massive, we can't even agree on how to start solving it, which is sort of an ironic situation to be in, right? If the problem weren't as bad, if the problem weren't as stark, then it would be easier to agree on trying out some solutions to it. And ironically, it would be probably easier to get to make progress on solving problems that were less pressing. But because the problems we have are so pressing, we can't even get started on them because we can't agree enough to get going. And so, so this is at least part of my hope, is that this technology in its idealistic sense will free us not only from sort of the shackles of toil and drudgery, but also get our eyes up out of the dirt, and get our vision higher, so that we can stop squabbling and we can actually make progress solving other problems. And one last piece to add to this is that the current way that we solve a lot of the coordination problems today inside the circle of the diagram that you've drawn there, Dan, is we depend on sort of a web. I guess in some sense it's a hierarchy, but really it's more of a web of markets, right? That are all sort of functioning together, and they're aligning incentives, but markets only work when there's scarcity. So that mechanism, that sort of a coordination and allocation mechanism, the market solution to the problem of allocating resources, that only works with scarcity. It doesn't work for things that are too cheap to bother putting a price tag on. And so that's, if a lot of things entered that category of being just too cheap to bother, applying competitive production dynamics to. So in other words, if I'm trying to think of an example, like where I live, water, for example, fresh water is in Michigan is so super abundant that we don't really have functioning markets for it. You can stick a pipe in the ground. You can literally hammer a pipe 8 feet into the ground and get as much water as any, unless you're Nestle and want to bottle 100 million gallons a day or whatever. I've mentioned this example in the past, I think. It's a super abundant resource, and so markets don't function around that here. There are different markets. There's a market for pipes and hammers to hammer them into the ground with, and there's a market for pumps and so forth, but not for the water itself, because it's just too abundant. And I'm wondering if a lot of things move into that category, we lose that market mechanism, and that in itself could be that in itself has potential upsides but also major downsides, right? If we lose the benefits of those mechanisms. So anyway, that's part of my thinking, is that localization of production could go hand in hand with the emergence of superabundance in a material sense, and the end of scarcity. And in some ways, we depend on that scarcity today, but that scarcity also is the source of many problems. So it's disentangling all of that is that's daunting, but it's part of what we got to think about, I guess.
I guess we'll have to wrap up in a minute. There's a new seminar this week which is about learning in cells. You're welcome to follow me to that, but I understand you might have to. That might be relevant to your interests in sort of related to our conversation last time, actually. But I want to pick up on one thing you said briefly, which is, Lavender and I often discuss how it's easy to think that democracy itself solves a lot of problems, but since democracy, at least very modern forms of it, have come hand in hand with a extended period of economic growth. It's maybe not so easy for us to disentangle the two. And I think that actually we don't know how to solve our problems. We just grow, and then the problems become less acute or they change. And to an extent, we came to think we'd solved a lot of coordination problems when in fact we just learned how to grow. And when growth slowed down, suddenly we discovered that actually we're really bad at solving coordination problems, and democracy doesn't help much, or it doesn't solve the problem. I'm not convinced that democracy can survive in a low growth environment, which is why I'm very skeptical of people who want to return to something like low growth or no growth and think that's sustainable. I'm much more skeptical of democracy in a low growth environment than most people. You just look at China, right? I mean, definitely not a democracy, but Chinese people are much more open to the idea of technology and technological disruption than people in the West. Why? Because they saw growth in their lives as a result of it in recent history. It's very straightforward, right? And not like growth in the sense of some segment of the population gets more of a fixed pie, but actual growth, right?
Right.
Broad-based growth. I very much agree with the sentiment I think you're expressing, which is that the key to getting people to sign on to disruption in their lives is to grow the economy in a real way for them, and then that's it, right? But that's hard, but I don't think there's much short of that. I don't know of any, and you could imagine new institutions or something else that might fix the problem I mentioned earlier and tie promises of benefits to, actually make the elites that make the decisions deliver on those promises. But I think it's in some sense very simple, right? We either grow or the problems don't go away. Maybe that's good news, right? Because the disruptions in principle should lead to growth, but maybe we should pick the order of the disruptions carefully or something, right? So that.
Well, let's. I know you've got to go, but let's pick this up right here next time. This is super exciting. It's a really, really interesting topic. I'm very sympathetic to it as my thinking has evolved over the last 10 years or so. I've come to think, I think, in ways that are very aligned with what you're saying here, but with some subtle differences too, and. What I think one thing that would be really great to talk about would be to define what we mean by growth and to unpack the, to disaggregate all of its different sort of all of the elements that comprise that and see which are the things that are essential, which are the things that are really beneficial, which are the things that we can, that we ought to really be continuing to grow. When we say economic growth or something like that, and what are the things that we need to decouple from economic growth that are currently coupled, that are not productive, but have just sort of been baggage or unintended consequences or side effects or whatever, the sort of pollution along the way kind of thing. And I think that, there's this hope in the environmental community, maybe a little bit in the degrowth community, that we can have that prosperity or not, it's typically not defined that way. It's typically this sort of psychological version of prosperity, almost purely psychological, really, which is called well-being. And the idea is that if we just have, if we just re-educate people to think differently about what constitutes well-being and a good life in their own personal lives, they will then see that they don't need material wealth in the same way, and they're not getting joy and satisfaction, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure you're familiar with that sort of narrative as well. I don't think that that's correct. I think there are major flaws with that. I think there are sort of trivial major flaws with that. And I think to ignore the material basis of prosperity is frankly idiotic. But technology certainly has the potential to deliver material prosperity, and perhaps in a way that allows the continuation of what has been useful as far as economic growth goes, like the really great benefits of that, especially, like the ones you mentioned, that keep the wolves away from the door and keep people, hands off of one of, fingers are off of one another's throats, kind of thing. And anyway, I would love to have a conversation where we really dig into that and think about, what, if we're talking about continuing to make progress and being more prosperous, what do we mean by that? Anyway, I think that could be something that some real interesting insights might come out of. So
yeah, sounds fun.
Okay, cool.
Thanks,
great.
Thanks a lot for today, Adam. Do you want to follow me for just a minute, or you got a job?
Yeah, sure. I'll come along with you.